Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back a few centuries to a time when the world looked a whole lot bigger, a whole lot emptier, and honestly, a whole lot wrong. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle into whatever blanket situation you've got going on, and let your brain coast into that soft, sleepy zone. Because tonight, we're talking about the map makers of the age of exploration, the people who shaped our understanding of the world while very much guessing a lot. And I mean a lot. Like, draw a dragon in the corner because we genuinely have no idea what's there levels of guessing. But, professionally. So take a deep breath. Let's float down to a time when Europe was busy trying to find spices, gold, and occasionally completely new continents, usually on accident. And the quiet, ink-stained folks behind the scenes were desperately trying to keep up with all these ambitious sailors who couldn't stop crashing into unexpected landmasses. Tonight, we're following the people who turned chaos into parchment. Let's begin. If you were a map maker, or a cartographer if you wanted to sound fancy enough to keep your job, sometime around the late 1400s or early 1500s, your life was probably a mixture of quiet monotony, ink fumes, and dealing with the world's most overconfident customers. Sailors came in after months at sea, handed you a crumpled journal soaked in salt water, and insisted that a mysterious island full of giant birds was definitely real because my cousin's friend saw it. And you, being a reasonable adult with a quill, some vellum, and bills to pay, would sigh gently and then draw it anyway. Not because you believed them, of course, but because explorers were basically the influencers of the 16th century. They had the clout. They had the sponsors, and if you didn't include their imaginary island of feathered nightmares, someone else would. So yes, a good portion of your job involved balancing scientific accuracy with the fragile egos of men who navigated by vibes half the time. But let's ease into the day-to-day life of a map maker. Picture a tiny workshop tucked into the back of a bustling port city, Lisbon, Seville, Venice, or Antwerp. Outside, sailors yelled at each other in 11 different dialects. Inside, you sat hunched over a wooden desk with a single window, providing just enough light to remind you that you'd chosen a career that slowly destroyed your eyesight. Your tools were simple: quills, ink made from soot or crushed oak galls, compasses, rulers, and stacks of parchment that cost as much as rent. And if you spilled ink on one, congratulations, you were now poor. Map making wasn't fast either. Drawing coastlines took hours, shading mountains took days, and labeling everything in neat little scripts could take weeks, especially if the official who commissioned your map insisted that every Latin letter curl like it had been styled with a 16th century hair iron. You weren't just drawing things, you were interpreting them, which meant you needed to understand math, astronomy, geography, and also how to keep a straight face when someone told you that Asia was only a few days' sail west. Because sure, why not? And yet, somehow, despite all the nonsense, map makers were respected. They were seen as scholarly, quiet, and maybe just a touch mysterious. After all, you were one of the few people who had a zoomed-out perspective of the world. While most people thought the next town over was basically the edge of existence, you were sitting there sketching coastlines of entire continents. It gave you a reputation for knowing more than you probably did. Even if half the world on your map was empty ocean with a polite note reading something like, "Here be monsters," possibly. Unclear. Now, there's something soothing about imagining these workshops. The slow scratch of quills, the dusty smell of vellum, the candle wax dripping onto the table, probably ruining something important. But don't worry, that's historically accurate. Wax ruined everything back then. Let's drift over, gently, to the part of map making that was less peaceful and a little more political. Because in the age of exploration, maps weren't just pretty pictures, they were weapons. Soft, papery weapons that countries used to claim places they'd never actually visited. For example, if Portugal wanted to argue that a distant coastline belonged to them, they didn't necessarily send diplomats, they just handed over a map where the coastline was shaded in the obviously ours color. And Spain might respond with their own map, shaded in the no, actually it's ours color. It was like a very passive-aggressive art competition. And sadly for you, the mapmaker, these disputes had consequences. If your map contradicted the wrong king's favorite navigator, you could get fined, yelled at, interrogated, or, worst-case scenario, fired, which in the 1500s was basically a precursor to starving. This meant that even the most talented mapmakers had to walk a delicate little line between scientific accuracy and royal propaganda. You might know full well that a coastline was 200 miles too far north, but if the king liked it that way, well, the king won. And that's why early world maps look like someone tried to draw the continents from memory after one glass of wine too many. But let's float over to the explorers again, because these were the people mapmakers depended on for data, and the quality of that data varied wildly. Some navigators were meticulous. They measured latitudes, tracked currents, drew little sketches of bays, and even recorded wind patterns. These were the people who made your job nice and boring. Others did not. Some explorers kept journals that read like cryptic poetry. Saw land to the west, might have been clouds. The men are tired. Thanks, Ferdinand. Very helpful. Others wildly estimated distances. Sailed 300 leagues today. Did you? Did you really? Or did it just feel like 300 leagues because the ship smelled of mold and despair? And then there were the guys who just lied outright. Sometimes because they wanted to impress their sponsors, sometimes because they were confused, and sometimes because they'd gotten lost for 3 weeks and were hoping nobody would notice. But the most consistently unreliable group, the sailors who came home bragging. These were the men who definitely saw a city of gold, or definitely found a giant waterfall, or definitely saw a sea serpent as long as the ship. And you, the long-suffering mapmaker, were expected to turn these half-drunk memories into usable geographic information. So, you did what every mapmaker did, drew something vague enough that it wouldn't get you in trouble. A curvy coastline here, a decorative sea monster there, maybe a small note in the margins, based on accounts of one guy who wouldn't stop yelling. But despite the chaos, early mapmaking did slowly improve. This was partly due to better navigation tools, and partly because some mapmakers traveled with the explorers themselves, which sounds adventurous, but really just meant seasickness, cramped quarters, and praying your ink didn't spill in a storm. Still, it was prestigious. Being the mapmaker on an expedition meant you actually got to see the world you were drawing, instead of relying on the memory of a sailor who thought dolphins were mermaids. And if you survived, which was not guaranteed, your maps held serious weight. People wanted first-hand observation, and you, the mapmaker, became something like a celebrity scholar. Quiet fame, but fame nonetheless. Let's drift a little deeper into the workshop, where one of the hardest parts of the job took place, labeling. Readers today overlook this, but map labels were essentially the typography Olympics. You had to squeeze entire place names into tiny coastlines without making them unreadable. And remember, no printing press for detailed maps yet, not really, not reliably, so everything was handwritten. Your handwriting became your brand. If it curled nicely and stayed consistent, your maps sold better. If it looked like you were trembling from too much wine, well, you probably were, but still. Most mapmakers ended up developing a calm, steady script that looked relaxed even when they weren't, sort of like pretending to be serene for 12 hours straight, a perfect fit for tonight's sleepy tone, honestly. Speaking of calmness, mapmakers had to keep their tempers in check, especially when patrons made helpful suggestions. A nobleman might stroll into your shop and point to a stretch of empty ocean on your nearly finished map and say something like, "Could you add a few islands there for aesthetics?" And you'd reply very politely that geography doesn't actually work like interior decorating, and he'd reply very confidently that he was paying you and liked islands. So you'd add the islands, because what's one more fictional archipelago between friends? Now let's gently drift into the emotional side of the job, the part historians don't talk about because admittedly it's not dramatic enough for textbooks, but it matters for our purposes. Being a mapmaker often meant long stretches of quiet isolation, days spent hunched over parchment, hours of repetitive strokes, the kind of routine that could either calm your soul or slowly dissolve your sanity. For many cartographers, priests, scholars, or So let's float back into that dim little workshop and continue. If you were a cartographer in the 1500s or 1600s, you probably lived with a constant low-level fear of being outdated. New reports came in weekly, sometimes daily. A ship would dock in the harbor, and suddenly everything you thought you knew about the coastline of Africa was wrong. Again, for the third time this month. And you would stare at your nearly finished map, the one you'd spent 2 weeks shading ever so delicately, and you'd have to erase half of it. Again. Mapmakers were basically doing data science, except their data sources were sunburned men who'd been living on salted fish for 8 months. A lot of numbers were, let's call them aspirational. Still, the technology of navigation did slowly improve. Instruments like the astrolabe, crossstaff, and eventually the sextant helped sailors get slightly more accurate readings of latitude. Only latitude, though. Longitude remained an absolute disaster for centuries. Longitude was the math problem that bullied everyone. Measuring it required accurate clocks, which didn't exist yet, and even after clocks were invented, they didn't take kindly to ship life. You'd set a perfect clock in Lisbon, sail out, hit one wave, and suddenly the mechanism was like, "I'm going to run 5 minutes fast for no reason. Enjoy being lost." Which meant sailors tried their best to guess longitude by dead reckoning, literally estimating based on direction and speed and vibes. Sometimes those vibes were correct. Sometimes the vibes were, this entire continent is 700 miles to the left for no clear reason. And mapmakers had to take that and turn it into something respectable. The result? Early globes and world maps looked like they were drawn by someone who had once heard about Earth, but never actually visited. But slowly, quietly, thanks to better sailing routes and repeated voyages, mapmakers began to cross-check notes. The more ships passed the same coastline, the clearer the shape became. Patterns emerged, errors were corrected, coasts smoothed out, and bit by bit, the world started coming into focus. Let's drift now to a particularly fun part of mapmaking, decorative things. Because mapmakers rarely just drew land, they drew giant compass roses, elaborate borders, detailed wind diagrams, ships bobbing in the ocean, and yes, sea monsters. Giant fish with the faces of lions, tentacled horrors that looked suspiciously like someone had never seen an octopus, and whales shaped like smiling blimps. Decorative cartography was basically the ancient version of clip art, but with more dragons. And it served a purpose. If you didn't know what a coastline looked like, you filled the empty space with artistry. It made the map feel complete. It looked impressive, and it distracted the viewer from the fact that half the world was still an educated guess. The monsters were also subtle disclaimers, something like, "Hey, we don't really know what's going on here. Proceed at your own risk." Mapmakers in Northern Europe especially loved these doodles. Perhaps because they spent so much time indoors during dark winters that drawing a whale wearing an unfathomable expression felt like a good emotional outlet. But these decorations weren't just for fun, they helped maps sell. A beautifully illustrated map could fetch far higher prices than a plain one. Executives loved aesthetic flourishes even in the 1500s. Some things never change. Let's float over to the business side for a moment, because mapmaking wasn't just an intellectual pursuit, it was a livelihood, and it was a risky one. You needed patrons, someone wealthy enough to commission maps, kings, princes, bishops, merchants, ship owners, or ambitious explorers who needed something to show investors. Patronage was everything. Without it, you were just a guy with ink stains on your sleeves and no income. So you learned to flatter well. A nobleman might request a map that subtly exaggerated his territory. Maybe his land was actually a narrow strip of coastline, but he'd prefer it to look more kingdom-shaped. And you, calmly and diplomatically, would give them a coastline that swooped outward just enough to stroke his ego, but not enough to get you accused of deliberate misinformation. Occasionally, a cartographer got caught between two powerful patrons who wanted contradictory things, and this was awkward. One king might insist a region belonged to him, another might insist the same region belonged to them, and both were paying good money. So you produced two copies of the map, one for each king, each slightly altered. You did not mention this fact to either side. Yes, early map makers were basically political chameleons. It was safer that way. But all this political flexibility had a price: extremely careful secrecy. Many kingdoms treated their maps like classified documents. They weren't for public consumption, they were military assets, especially the new ones, the updated ones, the ones showing newly discovered islands or strategic harbors. A leaked map could cost a country a colony, or worse, a war. So mapmakers often worked under strict rules. Some had to swear oaths, some could not publish anything without official approval. Some even had to surrender earlier drafts for destruction. Imagine spending 50 hours on a map only for the government to say, "Actually, no, burn it." Very soothing for the soul. Let's move calmly to another part of the mapmaker's life: competition. Because yes, there was drama in the mapmaking world. Slow, quiet, passive-aggressive drama, but drama all the same. The Renaissance saw the rise of highly competitive print shops in cities like Amsterdam, Antwerp, Venice, and Paris. These shops hired talented engravers to carve maps into metal plates so they could be printed and sold widely. The shops were businesses, and they wanted the best maps. Suddenly, accuracy mattered, style mattered, branding mattered. If someone released a map with a beautiful new typeface or a particularly elegant compass rose, other map makers noticed, and they might very gently borrow the idea. This led to a long tradition of cartographers accusing each other of copying, but always in the most polite tone possible. Something like, "I humbly observe that Master So-and-so's recent map bears a curious resemblance to mine, which was published earlier, though of course I am sure this was entirely accidental." In other words, "You traced my coastline, you fraud." But no yelling, that would be unseemly. Let's drift now toward the explorers again, the source of so much mapmaker misery. Because even though they're romanticized today, explorers were often extremely stressed men with questionable navigational skills. They got lost constantly. They argued constantly. They wrote logs that looked like the fever dreams of someone who had lived on hard biscuits for 8 months. A lot of numbers were, let's call them, aspirational. Still, the technology of navigation did slowly improve. Instruments like the astrolabe, cross-staff, and eventually the sextant helped sailors get slightly more accurate readings of latitude. Only latitude, though. Longitude remained an absolute disaster for centuries. Longitude was the math problem that bullied everyone. Measuring it required accurate clocks, which didn't exist yet. And even after clocks were invented, they didn't take kindly to ship life. You'd set a perfect clock in Lisbon, sail out, hit one wave, and suddenly the mechanism was like, I'm going to run 5 minutes fast for no reason. Enjoy being lost. Which meant sailors tried their best to guess longitude by dead reckoning, literally estimating based on direction and speed and vibes. Sometimes those vibes were correct. Sometimes the vibes were, this entire continent is 700 miles to the left for no clear reason. And mapmakers had to take that and turn it into something respectable. The result? Early globes and world maps looked like they were drawn by someone who had once heard about Earth, but never actually visited. But slowly, quietly, thanks to better sailing routes and repeated voyages, mapmakers began to cross-check notes. The more ships passed the same coastline, the clearer the shape became. Patterns emerged, errors were corrected, coasts smoothed out, and bit by bit, the world started coming into focus. Let's drift now to a particularly fun part of mapmaking, decorative things. Because mapmakers rarely just drew land, they drew giant compass roses, elaborate borders, detailed wind diagrams, ships bobbing in the ocean, and yes, sea monsters. Giant fish with the faces of lions, tentacled horrors that looked suspiciously like someone had never seen an octopus, and whales shaped like smiling blimps. Decorative cartography was basically the ancient version of clip art, but with more dragons. And it served a purpose. If you didn't know what a coastline looked like, you filled the empty space with artistry. It made the map feel complete. It looked impressive, and it distracted the viewer from the fact that half the world was still an educated guess. The monsters were also subtle disclaimers, something like, hey, we don't really know what's going on here. Proceed at your own risk. Mapmakers in Northern Europe especially loved these doodles, perhaps because they spent so much time indoors during dark winters that drawing a whale wearing an unfathomable expression felt like a good emotional outlet. But these decorations weren't just for fun, they helped maps sell. A beautifully illustrated map could fetch far higher prices than a plain one. Executives loved aesthetic flourishes even in the 1500s. Some things never change. Let's float over to the business side for a moment, because mapmaking wasn't just an intellectual pursuit, it was a livelihood, and it was a risky one. You needed patrons, someone wealthy enough to commission maps. Let's step gently into the city of Antwerp around the 1560s. It was one of the biggest commercial hubs in Europe, full of merchants who wanted maps, not to navigate. Oh no, that was far too practical, but to decorate their offices. Maps were status symbols now. If you were wealthy, you hung a giant wall map behind you so business partners would think you were someone who understood the world. This was especially funny when you consider that half the maps were wrong, but they looked impressive. They said, I know things, even if the only thing you actually knew was how to profit from imported cinnamon. Mapmakers leaned into this. They made big maps, beautiful maps, maps with flourishes so excessive that you needed to be rich just to afford the frame. The rising star of this era? Abraham Ortelius, a quiet, scholarly man from Antwerp, whose vibe was basically, what if I collected all the world's best maps, compared them, and made one giant, less wrong version? This simple idea became the atlas, a genre he practically invented. Ortelius published Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1570, and it was a hit. It was the Renaissance equivalent of releasing the most binge-worthy series on your streaming homepage. Everyone wanted it. Merchants, scholars, nobles, even people who had no plans to travel farther than their local tavern bought atlases because they looked intellectual. Mapmakers outside Antwerp were thrilled and annoyed in equal measure. Thrilled because atlases sold very well, annoyed because now Ortelius was the guy to beat. And he was hard to beat. He didn't travel at all. Not once. Not a single major voyage. He just sat in his workshop quietly collecting other people's work, comparing sources, and trying to sort out who was lying, who was confused, and who was accidentally describing the same coastline upside down. Honestly, a very relatable research process. His workshop was calm, gentle, the kind of place where every book had its spot, every page was treated like a sacred relic, and visitors had to whisper because the cartographer was thinking. Ortelius's secret talent? He had the patience of a saint. If you handed him 3 completely contradictory reports of the same island, he didn't scream, he didn't throw parchment, he didn't dramatically declare that the world was impossible to draw, even though it definitely was. Instead, he calmly analyzed every source, made a best-guess estimate, and moved on with his day. The man was basically the Renaissance embodiment of "it is what it is." And in the sleepy tradition of mapmaking, his success influenced everyone. Let's drift now from Antwerp down to Venice, another hub of beautifully engraved maps, because Venetians couldn't resist making everything expensive and artistic. Venetian maps were decorative masterpieces. If Antwerp maps were practical, Venetian ones were elegant. And if you were a cartographer working in Venice, you were constantly under pressure to make maps that looked, well, Venetian. Everything had to be ornate, stylish, a little dramatic, but not too dramatic, tasteful drama. If your compass rose looked anything less than stunning, someone would tell you. One Venetian engraver reportedly spent 3 days shading a single mountain range until it looked like a Renaissance painting. People treasured these maps, not for navigation, oh no, but because they matched their paneling. And while all this was happening, Amsterdam joined the game too. By the early 1600s, Dutch mapmakers started overtaking everyone. They had printing presses, they had trade networks, they had money. They also had a national obsession with cataloging everything, including tulips, legal codes, cheese taxes, and yes, coastlines. Amsterdam's biggest cartographic family, the Blauw family, ran a map empire. Their shop printed maps so consistently and so beautifully that they practically became the Apple of the cartography world. Sleek, stylish, expensive. Everyone wanted a Blauw map. You could walk into their workshop and see engraved plates stacked like pancakes, each one containing a different corner of the world. Copper plates that had taken months to carve, full of tiny details only visible with a magnifying glass. And outside, their large windows filled the room with natural light, perfect for engravers who needed to see every dot, but terrible for anyone who valued their circadian rhythm. The Blauw workshop was calm but bustling, engravers tapping quietly on metal plates, apprentices preparing ink, cartographers reviewing journals from Dutch East India Company sailors who had spent so long at sea they forgot how chairs worked. It was a calm chaos, highly productive, highly caffeinated, if coffee had been widely available. But even without it, the Blauws worked like the world depended on their atlases being perfect. And honestly, the world sort of did. Let's drift to a quieter, more contemplative part of this story, the emotional tension between accuracy and aesthetic. Mapmakers in the Golden Age were constantly balancing 2 goals. Make the map correct. Make it pretty enough that rich people want to buy it. These 2 things did not always overlap. Sometimes accuracy made things ugly. A coastline looked too jagged. A region was too empty. A border was uncertain. A mountain range was inconveniently shaped. But aesthetic sense wanted smooth lines, elegant shading, pleasing compositions. So a cartographer might think, do I draw the coastline as it is or as it should be if the world understood symmetry? And occasionally, symmetry won. Not often, but enough that some historical atlases contain corrected coastlines that are only correct in the sense that they look nicer. Let's float now into the workshop vibe, always one of our coziest places. Imagine a 17th century cartographer sitting at a desk wearing thick wool because heating was expensive and the windows didn't seal properly. Outside, canal water gently lapped against stones. Inside, the room smelled like parchment, drying ink, and beeswax polish. The cartographer's hands were steady. Their strokes were deliberate, their eyes strained but focused. In the corner, an apprentice quietly stirred ink. Another apprentice prepared paper. No one spoke unless it was necessary. Too much talking risked someone smudging a line. It was, in its own odd way, peaceful. We tend to imagine the age of exploration as thrilling, sailors braving storms, merchants negotiating across continents, empires rising and falling. But cartographers lived in the gentler version of that world, the quiet after the storm, where someone had to make sense of everything. Let's drift gently to the frustrations they faced. One of the biggest problems in mapmaking was the lack of standardized spelling. Every traveler spelled place names differently. Some used local names, some used Latinized versions, some wrote down whatever they thought they heard, and many explorers had questionable hearing, especially after months of roaring ocean winds. So a single island might appear as Chebaro, Chabaro, Xabaro, Jabaro, and on one legendary map, the isle which the captain describes as being shaped like a pig. If you were a cartographer, you had to choose one spelling, and no matter what you chose, someone would write you a passive-aggressive letter about how wrong you were. Cartographers received a lot of letters like that. Let's drift on. Another challenge was translating spherical Earth onto flat paper. Projection methods multiplied, each with their own weird distortions. Mercator's projection became famous because it was great for navigation, but it made Greenland look like it was auditioning for the role of seventh continent. Other projections tried different distortions. Some maps looked normal. Some looked like the continents had melted. Some looked like the cartographer had given up halfway through and decided to let geometry express itself artistically. If this sounds like a messy technical nightmare, it was, but cartographers handled it with the same calm resignation as everything else. They'd simply say, "Ah yes, the world has once again refused to cooperate with mathematics," and then continue shading patiently. Let's move to something more human now. Despite their quiet reputations, many cartographers struggled with burnout, long hours, eye strain, constant pressure for accuracy, endless revisions, clients who changed demands, governments that wanted secrecy, printers who needed plates engraved yesterday. And on top of that, the world kept changing. New islands, new trade routes, new political borders, new wars, new empires, everything shifting constantly. Every time the world changed, a cartographer sighed, reached for a fresh sheet of paper, and began again. But there was beauty in that too. There was something lovely about capturing a moment in time, even if the moment didn't last. Every map was temporary. Every map was a snapshot of human knowledge at that exact second. And cartographers knew this. They lived with that impermanence, quietly, gracefully. Let's drift into the last part of Part 3, the rise of global trade and the explosion of information. By the late 1600s, ships were sailing worldwide with increasing frequency. Asia, Africa, the Americas, routes were mapped, distances refined, and errors corrected. Suddenly, cartographers had more data than they knew what to do with. Thousands of logs, hundreds of maps, competing claims, conflicting descriptions. Mapmakers had become librarians of the world's confusion. They spread out sources on their desks, cross-referenced coastlines, compared sketches, measured latitudes, triple-checked longitudes, and always tried, to draw something coherent. Now, one of the funnier things about being a cartographer in the age of exploration is that everyone treated you like an oracle, right up until your predictions were proven wildly incorrect, which didn't take more than a few months usually. But that didn't stop the trend. Every time a ship returned from some half-documented voyage, kings and patrons immediately summoned their mapmakers and demanded, calmly, politely, and with only moderate passive aggression, that they incorporate the new information. The problem was that new information was usually incomplete, contradictory, or delivered by sailors who had been hallucinating on scurvy-induced brain fog for 3 weeks straight. And yet, mapmakers wrote it all down because, employment. And perhaps also because they genuinely believed that maybe, just maybe, this new report would finally make the continents line up the way they were supposed to. It never did. But that didn't stop the optimism. Imagine a Portuguese mapmaker listening to a sailor who swore he saw a vast southern continent stretching endlessly to the horizon. The mapmaker nods, takes a sip of wine, and thinks, sure, why not? Big continent, let's add that. And that's how things like Terra Australis Incognita ended up eating half the southern hemisphere on European maps. Just a giant decorative landmass no one had ever stepped on, drawn purely because it felt balanced. Practically feng shui for cartography. And the oddest thing? People believed it. Not because it looked realistic, but because it looked confident. A mapmaker's greatest skill wasn't accuracy, it was persuasion. Let's float to another delightful disaster. Somewhere between geography and fan fiction. One recurring issue was that mapmakers really did not like blank spaces. A blank region suggested ignorance, and ignorance suggested you weren't worth paying. So the rule was simple. If you don't know what's there, fill it with something fancy. Merchants loved rivers, so you draw a river. Kings loved gold, so you draw a kingdom. Monks loved mythical Christians living in distant lands, so you add good old Prester John, the fan-favorite imaginary priest king who popped up everywhere from India to Ethiopia, depending on which mapmaker needed to fill their margins that decade. And there was another reason blank spaces were frowned upon. Let's call it the early modern ego problem. Europeans of the 1500s weren't exactly known for admitting that they didn't know things. So instead of uncertainty, you get a detailed coastline of someplace absolutely no one had visited, drawn by someone who had never even seen the ocean, based entirely on one sailor's cousin's half-remembered story. But still, the map looked beautiful, and in the age of exploration, beauty counted for accuracy. In fact, the prettier the map, the more people trusted it. That's why cartographers spent hours, days, months decorating their creations with compass roses, delicate scroll work, and sea monsters that looked suspiciously like farm animals wearing ocean-themed Halloween costumes. Those sea monsters were amazing. They had the dramatic flair of creatures who were absolutely not real, but desperately wanted to be. A dolphin? No, make it a lion with scales. A whale? Too simple, add wings. A giant squid? Sure, but make it sexy somehow. People loved them, and so did mapmakers, because a well-placed sea monster not only filled a blank space, but also warned sailors not to question your creative liberties. If you're brave enough to draw a dragon eating a ship, no one is going to critique your guess about the shape of South America. Let's drift to the academia of wrongness. Now, you might think mapmakers relied only on sailors, but there was an entire academic side to cartography, too. Universities taught things like geometry, astronomy, and the art of taking measurements with tools that were only moderately helpful and frequently broken. A student might be given a device that was supposed to measure angles using the stars, and in perfect conditions, clear sky, steady hand, zero wind, it could almost measure things accurately. But conditions at sea were never perfect. The sky was usually cloudy, the ship always rocked, and drunken sailors bumped into you every time you tried to hold still. Yet those numbers, wildly off though they were, became coordinates on a map, and once written in ink, they became very official numbers that scholars would debate for decades. One of the funniest academic debates of the era was on longitude. Nobody could measure it properly for centuries, which meant that the same coastline put South America in totally different places. But instead of admitting confusion, mapmakers argued themselves into circles. This coast is 20 degrees west. No, it's 10 degrees east. No, you are 30 degrees wrong. Meanwhile, the coastline itself sat there, unchanged, sighing quietly. Academics also argued about the existence of certain islands that never existed. These phantom islands popped up everywhere. Some were invented by sailors, others were misread shadows, and some were probably just floating ice mistaken for land. But once a mapmaker drew an island, oh, it was real, and it stayed real for centuries. Entire diplomatic discussions were held over imaginary land masses. People got into feuds. Nations nearly declared war. Meanwhile, mapmakers shrugged and just kept drawing more. Why? Again, no empty spaces. Every map was a personality test. Mapmakers weren't just technicians, they were artists with very specific styles. Some loved dramatic coastlines, others adored giant borders. Some favored excessive labels that wrapped around entire oceans. A few had a preference for overly curvy continents that made Africa look like it was leaning seductively toward Europe. Mapmakers loved showing off. For example, Portuguese maps, look at our trade routes, tremble before them. Spanish maps, we own everything. No, really, everything. Dutch maps, our ships are better than yours. English maps, we're totally fine, not compensating for anything. Everything is completely under control. In many cases, maps were propaganda first, navigation second, and accurate geography a distant third. The goal was to make your kingdom look more impressive, more knowledgeable, and more global than your rivals. If that meant giving your country an extra large coastline or shrinking someone else's empire, well, ink is cheap and ego is priceless. And this wasn't considered cheating, it was considered patriotism. The more your map exaggerated your nation's success, the more loyal you were deemed. Some kings even hired specific map makers because they liked the way they drew the homeland. Not more accurate, just prettier. Map guilds, the quiet drama factories. Mapmakers also formed guilds, which were basically professional clubs with a side of quiet rivalry. Members guarded techniques like trade secrets, measurement methods, confidential, special pigments, locked away, fancy parchment preparation, lips sealed. If you wanted into the guild, you needed years of training, connections, and the ability to pretend that you didn't immediately fall asleep during lectures on spherical trigonometry. Guilds also protected their members from royal outbursts. If a king was unhappy with a map, maybe his favorite coastline looked too small or an enemy empire looked too powerful, the guild could intervene, buffering the poor cartographer from the monarch's displeasure. But the guild also had its drama. Petty arguments about color palettes, decades-long feuds over projection methods, heated debates about whether a map should be oriented north or east. Yes, people fought over which direction should go on top, and with the intensity of people arguing about sports teams. The north-up standard wasn't universal for a long time.
Some maps pointed eastward, which is why the word orientation literally refers to facing the Orient. If you ever wondered why Europe occasionally looks like it's tilted on older maps, it's because someone decided the sunrise felt like the right vibe for up. These disagreements didn't ruin relationships, but they certainly gave guild meetings the energy of a very slow, very polite family argument where no one raises their voice, but everyone is definitely judging everyone else.
So let's drift back into it, slowly, smoothly, and with the appropriate amount of affectionate judgment. The Great Compass Mystery, still less mysterious than the sailors. One of the most important tools of early navigation was the humble compass, a small magnetic needle that pointed north, unless it didn't. Early modern compasses were finicky little creatures. They could be thrown off by iron nails in the deck, metal buckles, nearby weaponry, the ship's stove, and probably intense emotions, honestly. Anything within a few feet could tilt the reading. But sailors trusted them anyway, deeply, passionately, sometimes a little too much. They stared at that needle like it held the secrets of the universe, which, to be fair, for them it kind of did. And so mapmakers back home would eagerly gather compass readings. 40 degrees west, southwest of the place with the big rock that looks like a turtle. North by almost north but not quite north of the coastline that felt spooky. 5 degrees east of the island that may or may not exist. And the mapmaker had to interpret this calmly, quietly, without screaming, and then convert it all into elegant ink lines that looked confident. But of course, compass readings weren't the only issue. There was the matter of declination, the slight angle difference between magnetic north and true north. Today, it's an easy adjustment. Back then, no one agreed on how to calculate it. The magnetic pole also wanders over time, which was just rude, honestly. The result? 2 ships could sail the same route, write down radically different compass bearings, hand them to a cartographer, and then blame him when the map looked like 2 toddlers drew different versions of the same coastline. The astrolabe, a tool designed to test your patience. Next up is one of history's favorite navigational devices, the astrolabe, a beautiful brass instrument with rotating discs and delicate markings, basically the Renaissance version of a scientific fidget spinner. Astrolabes were used to measure the altitude of celestial bodies, in theory. In practice, imagine standing on a violently rocking ship holding a metal dinner plate with holes in it, trying to line it up with the sun while the rope rigging smacks you in the face every 3 seconds. Most sailors used it once, said absolutely not, and handed the job to the youngest apprentice aboard. But here's the fun part. Those measurements, taken by someone who probably had a head injury, sunburn, and partial dehydration, ended up in the official logs, and the logs went straight to the mapmaker's desk. So our poor cartographer would receive a carefully scripted entry, measured the sun at 52 degrees, which probably meant the apprentice dropped the astrolabe, the ship lurched 20 degrees, and the sun was behind a cloud, but we wrote down the last number we saw before someone yelled to reef the sails. And yet, the map had to be drawn. The cross staff, great for eyesight damage. Let's drift gently toward another beloved tool, the cross staff. It looked like a T-shaped stick. You held it up to your face, aligned the horizontal bar with the horizon, then slid the vertical stick to line up with the sun. This meant you were literally staring directly into the sun. Blindness? Job hazard. Mapmakers knew sailors were risking their retinas for these readings, which is really tragic when you remember that wave movement made the measurements nearly useless. But the sailors tried, and trying was enough to keep the cartographers in business. Still, a cross-staff reading off by 2 degrees could shift a coastline by something like 50 miles, and 2 degrees off was considered a good day. So every mapmaker had a quiet ritual. Look at the numbers, nod slowly, whisper to themselves, close enough, and draw the coastline anyway. And that's how geography happened. Dead reckoning, the art of hoping for the best. Let's glide into the soft, drifting world of dead reckoning, essentially the method of estimating where you are based on where you hope you went. Navigators would note their speed, guessed, direction, vague, and time traveled, also guessed, then plot their location by tracing a line across their mental map of the ocean. Speed was measured using a log line, a rope with knots tied at intervals, tossed off the stern while counting seconds. Sounds scientific, right? Except the number of knots, the ship's drag, the irregular current, and how quickly the sailor was counting all affected the reading. Imagine trusting your life to someone going 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi in storm winds. But guess what? These dead-reckoned positions went into logbooks, the logbooks went to cartographers, and cartographers made maps based on them. It was a system based on optimism, and lots of it. But here's the beautiful part. Despite all the chaos, maps gradually improved, slowly, painfully, occasionally. Dead reckoning wasn't perfect, but it was something. And in the age of exploration, something was a luxury. Latitude, the one thing they could mostly do right. To be fair, early navigators could determine latitude, north-south position, with reasonable accuracy. Using the angle of the sun or stars, they could tell how far they were from the equator. This gave mapmakers one stable number to cling to, one point of sanity in the oceanic madness. So if a sailor wrote down latitude 23 degrees 10 minutes north, the cartographer could accept it like a precious gift from the heavens. But longitude, though? Longitude was chaos, chaos with waves. But latitude was the one friend that didn't lie. So when you look at early maps and notice that coastlines are roughly correct north to south, but wildly distorted east to west, that's why. Latitude was reliable, longitude was a circus. But mapmakers did their best, smoothing out coastlines like they were ironing a very wrinkled shirt. Sometimes they smoothed too much, sometimes too little, but at least the general vertical placement was okay. Marginally. Portolan charts, the magical maps that worked, sort of. Portolan charts were one of the first reliable map types. They were nautical charts covered in radiating lines that showed sailing directions between ports. These lines looked like a starburst exploded across the page, elegant, geometric, and weirdly hypnotic. They worked well in the Mediterranean, where distances were short and coastlines familiar, but once sailors ventured into the Atlantic, portolans became less accurate. The lines assumed a spherical world could be represented on a flat sheet of parchment without distortion, which is adorable, scientifically speaking. Mapmakers copied portolan charts from hand for centuries, sometimes so precisely that errors were replicated for generations, like a family recipe no one questions even though it tastes a little wrong. If a coastline was wrong on one chart, it became wrong on 100 charts. And nobody noticed because sailors didn't navigate by comparing maps. They navigated by feel, intuition, and arguing loudly on the deck while pointing at the horizon. But from the perspective of the mapmaker, portolans were sacred. The original templates were guarded with dragon-level protectiveness. Teaching someone the method required years of trust. And the funny part, portolan charts were more accurate than many later printed maps because they came from real observation, not academic speculation. But the age of exploration moved too fast for tradition. Oceanic voyages grew longer, the world expanded beyond the comfortable reach of Mediterranean knowledge, and the portolans started to look more like decorative tablecloths than global guides. So the mapmaker shifted, slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. Projection problems, or how to flatten a planet incorrectly. Let's drift toward one of the sleepiest arguments in cartographic history, map projections. How do you turn a curved Earth into a flat map without squishing it into something unrecognizable? Short answer, you don't. Not perfectly. Longer answer, you choose which part of the world you want to distort and accept the consequences. Early cartographers picked projections like they picked wine.
based on personal taste, reputation, and what was lying around. Some projections stretched the poles, some warped the equator, some made continents look upside down. A few turned the world into something resembling a deflated orange peel. The famous Mercator projection came along in the 1560s and tried to fix the directional problems for navigators. It worked beautifully for sailing routes, but hilariously exaggerated land area near the poles. Greenland became the size of Africa. Canada looked like a heavyweight champion, but navigators loved it because it made straight lines actually straight. Mapmakers sighed, nodded, and adopted it, even though they knew it was wrong and expected to draw the Arctic like an inflated marshmallow. But that's what cartography was, the noble art of choosing which kind of wrongness you could live with. The quiet crisis of too much information. By the late 1500s, something interesting happened. Explorers kept dumping more and more new information onto cartographers' desks. Entire coastlines, new islands, rivers that flowed in contradictory directions, settlements that appeared, vanished, reappeared, and sometimes moved for no reason other than sailors forgetting where they saw them. And for the first time in history, cartographers had too much data. Too many names, too many coordinates, too many reports. It wasn't quality information, let's not pretend, but there was a lot of it. So cartographers had to choose which sources to trust. Some had favored explorers, others trusted certain nations, a few relied on astronomers or mathematicians, and some chose the funniest stories, because if you're going to draw nonsense, it might as well be entertaining. The job shifted from draw lines to interpret the entire world through inconsistent gossip. But the age of exploration was nothing if not enthusiastically disorganized, and mapmakers thrived in the chaos, transforming messy scraps of information into gorgeous, if deeply misguided representations of the planet. They were historians, artists, scientists, and occasional improvisers, all rolled into one quietly suffering individual with ink-stained fingers and a permanent expression of polite exhaustion. And the world kept expanding, which meant more work, more contradictions, more revisions, and more opportunities to draw little sea monsters in the margins.
The sacred furniture of cartographers. Mostly just tables, but very serious tables. Every workshop had one crucial feature: the table. Not just any table, oh no. This table was wide, flat, and treated with the reverence of a religious artifact. You didn't put drinks on it. You didn't lean on it. You didn't even breathe near it unless you were prepared to steady the parchment with your hand. The table had to be ridiculously stable. Mapmakers lived in fear of wobbles. One tiny shake could ripple through a coastline and turn a dignified bay into a drunken-looking scribble. Many craftsmen spent more time maintaining the table than maintaining themselves. Some added sandbags to the legs, others reinforced the structure with beams. A few built their tables into the wall itself, because when accuracy is already a lost cause, structural stability is the least you can offer. On top of that table sat the tools of the trade: rulers, compasses, dividers, squares, pens, quills, ink pots, pigment stones, polishing cloths, and the eternal stack of questionable sailor notes threatening to slide out of order. All arranged in tidy rows, because chaos belonged outside, with the explorers. Mapmakers preferred their chaos in carefully labeled heaps. A day in the life, a symphony of quiet frustration. Life as a mapmaker was calm in the way that only the chronically overworked can achieve. Their routine flowed like this: wake up, stretch, regret staying up too late finishing coastline shading. Boil water, consider tea, end up drinking something halfway between tea, broth, and whatever leaves happened to be nearby. Breakfast was optional. Ink-stained fingers were guaranteed. Then, sitting at the table, the day began with sorting through new reports. maybe a letter from a merchant, maybe a rough sketch from a ship captain, maybe a piece of parchment stained with salt water, smudges, and someone's half-legible handwriting describing a coastline of moderate appeal. The cartographer had to decode all of it with monk-like patience. He'd flatten the parchment, weigh down the corners, and begin comparing this brand new contradiction to all the older contradictions. This was the art of map-making. Slow, quiet acceptance that the world stubbornly refused to match previous drafts. By midday, the cartographer might have drawn 4 new capes, named 2 rivers, erased 1 peninsula, re-added that peninsula after reconsidering, added shading to a mountain range because the map was feeling unbalanced, redrawn a bay that still wasn't satisfying, stared blankly at a weird note saying, "Coast bends to the left, but also to the right." He'd sigh, deeply, the kind of sigh a historian emits when someone says, "Maybe Atlantis was real." And then he would continue. This was not a job for passion, it was a job for endurance. But quietly, many cartographers did love it, in their own exhausted way. Parchment, the material that never behaved. Let's float over to the material itself. Parchment, a finicky creature. It came from animal skin, typically sheep or goat, which meant every single sheet had unpredictable quirks. Some pieces stretched unevenly, others curled at the edges. Some absorbed ink smoothly, others repelled it like the parchment had personal issues with the cartographer. Humidity could warp it, cold could stiffen it, heat could make it brittle, and yet parchment was the king of cartographic surfaces before widespread paper. You didn't waste good parchment, ever. If you made a mistake, you scraped the ink off with a knife, gently, patiently, pretending you were absolutely not crying inside. But as you scraped, the surface thinned, and if it thinned too much, rip, catastrophe. That was how cartographers developed the flat expression of someone who has known deep disappointment. Later, paper came along, cheaper, easier, less temperamental, but early explorers and kings still loved parchment maps because they felt luxurious, important, serious. Paper was for everyday business. Parchment was for pointing at dramatically during strategy meetings. Mapmakers knew this and adjusted accordingly. They treated parchment sheets like fragile treasure. The careful handling added hours to their workday, but kings loved the prestige, and prestige kept commissions rolling in. Ink, a recipe for stains and questionable decisions. Ink was another challenge, the magical blend that needed to flow smoothly, dry evenly, and resist fading over time. But every mapmaker had their own secret formula. Oak gall ink was popular, made from plant galls, iron salts, wine, and just enough chaos to make each batch unpredictable. And the colors, oh, the colors. Expensive pigments like ultramarine were reserved for special maps. Anything involving Asia or the Holy Land? Sure, go ahead. Bright blue sapphire coastlines. But a map of some random European river system? Absolutely not. You get brown. Maybe green if the patron is generous. Red ink made from cinnabar or lead compounds was used for borders, important labels, and dramatic emphasis. It also slowly poisoned the user through skin absorption, which explains a lot about the chronic lethargy of cartographers. Yellow pigment tended to fade. Purple was expensive. Gold leaf was for royalty only, and black ink varied from beautifully smooth to chunky and sad. Mapmakers spent hours testing consistency, dabbing test strokes, adjusting mixtures, remixing when it went wrong, because once the ink touched parchment, there was no going back, unless you wanted to scrape at the surface like you were performing surgery on a disgruntled goat. Many mapmakers ended their careers with permanently ink-stained fingers. Some saw it as a badge of honor, others just considered it inevitable. Either way, the stains never came out. working with sailor sketches a comedy of errors. Let's float over to one of the sleepiest and most quietly tragic parts of the job, interpreting sailor-made sketches. Imagine being handed a drawing that looks like a potato with squiggly lines on either side, labeled possible coastline. The sailor explains, "Yes, this is exactly what we saw." The cartographer nods politely, thinking, "This looks like a child drew a continent after spinning in a circle." But instead of questioning it outright, the cartographer compares it with other equally questionable sketches, hoping that somewhere in this pile of nautical fan fiction lies the truth. Sometimes different captains described the same coastline in hilariously different ways. Captain A, long and straight. Captain B, curved and jagged. Captain C, like a sleeping dragon. Captain D, cannot recall, was vomiting. The cartographer squints, sips wine, draws something in the middle. That's cartography, a compromise between four people who disagree about what shape land is. And don't forget the translation issues. A Portuguese sailor might describe a bay as small. A Spanish sailor might describe the same bay as huge and treacherous. An English sailor might call it adequate. A French sailor might call it unimpressive, like English cooking. Mapmakers learned to filter all this into one neutral description: bay of moderate size. Elegantly vague, perfect for maps. No sailors offended. Royal commissions, equal parts honor and horror. Occasionally, a cartographer received a royal commission. This was both good and terrible. Good because it meant payment, terrible because kings were notoriously picky and frequently wrong. A monarch might say, "I want our borders drawn bigger," or "My cousin, the king of somewhere else, claims his coastline is longer than mine, make mine longer." Or, "Move this river, I don't like where it is." The cartographer would politely mention that rivers don't move. The king would glare. The cartographer would quietly move the river. Royal geography was flexible. Some kings wanted every new map to show them discovering more land than rivals. Others wanted decorative borders so elaborate they looked like the mapmaker slipped into a trance of ornamental delirium. Mapmakers sighed, bowed, and delivered. And sometimes, after the king approved the map, it had to be recopied beautifully, cleanly, without a single ink mistake. This copying could take weeks, months even. One wrong stroke meant starting the entire sheet over. This is how cartographers perfected the expression of calm, subtle despair. Guild life, a quiet web of rivalries. If the mapmaker belonged to a guild, things became even more interesting. Guild halls were peaceful on the surface, but beneath it all swirled centuries of petty disputes. Arguments about which projection method was superior, debates over the proper shading of mountain ranges, whether coastlines should be thick or thin, whose compass roses were a little too ornate. Very polite drama, very slow moving, very sleep-friendly. Guilds guarded knowledge. Apprentices spent years learning how to prepare parchment, mix ink, draw clean lines, and calculate positions. Only after proving competence could an apprentice create an independent map. Some map makers became masters, some became inspectors. A few became legendary for their decorative flourishes, famous not for accuracy, but for drawing the most majestic sea monsters imaginable. A map with a well-drawn kraken in the corner meant prestige, not because the kraken existed, but because the cartographer clearly had artistic flair. The slow reward, seeing your work travel the world. Despite the exhaustion, the uncertainty, and the constant need to reinterpret bad data, there was something magical about being a cartographer. Their work traveled farther than they ever would. Maps were loaded onto ships, carried across oceans, consulted by merchants, admired by nobles, and spread throughout courts and academies. Some maps became famous. Others quietly guided sailors through storms. Some hung in...
So let's drift on. Now, if you've been with me so far,
You already know that royal patrons could be a mixed blessing. On the one hand, money, which is really the only thing that keeps an early modern craftsman going, aside from maybe a steady supply of salted fish and the occasional compliment. On the other hand, royal patrons were also some of the most impatient, paranoid, and geographically confused customers a mapmaker could possibly ask for. And remember, they had both power and very delicate egos. Never a charming mix. So imagine you're a mapmaker in 1580. You're sitting in your workshop, surrounded by sharpened quills and half-drying sheets of vellum. You've just spent 10 hours carefully shading the riverbanks of a place you've never seen because someone's nephew wrote a letter about it once. And just when you think you can finally stand up and maybe stretch your spine back into human alignment, a royal messenger bangs on the door and announces that His Majesty would like you to redraw everything to make it look more realistic. Realistic? Compared to what? But that part never gets explained. Mapmakers had to navigate this polite chaos constantly. Kings and queens loved maps, loved them. They hoarded them the way some people hoard limited edition sneakers. But many of them also had absolutely no idea how geography worked, which led to that classic moment in every cartographer's life, the unasked for suggestion. Things like, "Can we move that mountain range a bit to the left? It interferes with my border." Or, "Portugal looks too small. Make it bigger. I don't want my guests to think we are weak." Or the truly iconic, "No, I have decided that the sea does not go there." And the poor mapmaker is standing there, quill in hand, thinking, "Sir, that is literally where the ocean is." But of course he can't say that because this is a king, and the king is not wrong. The world apparently is. Let's drift gently to a case study. Not too fast, just slowly enough that you don't actually picture anyone yelling. So, King Philip II of Spain, collector of maps, overly specific about coastline aesthetics, known for sending extremely detailed notes on charts he personally could not read without squinting. Philip had a fondness for micromanaging his empire's cartography, which, extended across half the planet. Mapmakers near him were under constant pressure to keep up, and also to avoid mentioning any inconvenient truths like, "We don't fully know what the Pacific looks like yet." Philip wanted accuracy, but he wanted it in a way that only someone with zero actual experience navigating a ship could desire. Suddenly, a mapmaker would receive a little letter, all polite and flowery, requesting that the shape of the Philippine Islands be adjusted, not because a new survey had come in, but because he preferred them to look more aesthetically pleasing on the page. No pressure, though. Meanwhile, Portuguese mapmakers lived in a different world of royal expectations. The kings of Portugal were obsessed with secrecy. They treated maps like classified government documents, which they basically were. But secrecy creates paranoia, and paranoia creates stress, and stress creates the kind of mistakes that ruin a perfectly calm evening of ink and vellum work. Imagine you've spent a month working on a map of the coastline of Mozambique, trying to represent waves using little hand-drawn curls like you saw in a fancy atlas once. You're finishing the final touches, feeling kind of proud, when suddenly the royal guard walks in and demands you burn it because someone overheard someone else whispering that the English might have seen a copy. And then you have to start over, but with vaguer outlines this time, because royal instructions are great at being specific about what not to include and completely unhelpful about what should remain. Let's drift over to France now, slowly, like a cloud that can't be bothered. French kings were the types who commissioned maps because they liked showing them off to visitors. They weren't particularly worried about accuracy, which was honestly a relief for the mapmakers, but they did insist that everything look beautiful. Très élégant, fully ornamented. You weren't just drawing a coastline, you were designing wall decor. So French cartographers lived in a kind of artistic purgatory. Their deadlines were relaxed, but their expectations were, please draw 14 decorative ships in this ocean and also add cherubs at a compass rose with 32 points, even though your hand is already cramping. Many of them had this strange double life, half geographer, half illustrator of mythical sea monsters. Clients wanted maps that could impress aristocratic dinner guests, not maps that sailors could actually use without getting lost. So one minute you're labeling a mountain range, and the next you're sketching an inexplicable winged fish because someone insisted the page looked too empty. Mapmakers, in their soft, monotone exhaustion, realized pretty quickly that royalty didn't actually want information. They wanted vibes, prestige, a sense of owning the world on parchment. And as long as that world looked impressive, no one seemed too concerned about whether the coastline of West Africa had an extra squiggle or a missing gulf. But then again, sometimes the royal requests got unusually practical, and that was even worse. Take Henry VIII. It's always Henry VIII. Absolutely always. He wasn't content with breaking from the Catholic Church, or scaring every wife he ever had, or trying to convince people that he still had functioning knees in his later portraits. He also decided he needed new coastal defense maps immediately, because the French might invade. Probably. Maybe. Or maybe not, but it was better to be safe. So the map makers at his court found themselves forced to create a massive series of coastal surveys, but also make them nice-looking enough that he could show them off like a medieval PowerPoint presentation. Henry would hover over them, pointing with a stubby, bejeweled finger at some random cliff on the page, going, "Is that where they will land? Should we build a fort? Build a fort there. Yes, right there. No, more to the left. No, that's too far. No, now I'm not sure." And the map makers would nod politely and redraw everything a fifth time. They were living in a never-ending session of being micromanaged by someone who just discovered maps were cool. But map makers also relied on royals for professional protection. Without a patron, they had to deal with everyday issues like bankruptcy, creditors, and the occasional angry merchant who insisted that their hometown was definitely more important than you made it look. Royal commissions paid well and offered stability, but that stability came with a catch. You were now effectively a very fancy art therapist for a monarch's geopolitical anxieties. Let's slide over, slowly, like you're just drifting down a calm river, to another delightful complication: political censorship. Royal patrons didn't just want aesthetically pleasing maps, they wanted loyal maps. Maps that didn't accidentally suggest their empire was smaller than it claimed to be. Maps that didn't acknowledge the existence of disputed territory unless the king personally approved of acknowledging it that week. So, if you were making a map of, say, the border between France and Spain, you had to be very careful. Very careful. Because if you placed the border too far to the east, the French would accuse you of insulting them. Too far to the west, and the Spanish would say you were basically committing cartographic treason. Some map makers solved this by being vague, a very artistic vagueness. They'd draw a forest over the disputed land, or maybe a decorative cartouche that conveniently covered everything. Basically, look, Your Majesty, it's not that I don't want to draw your borders exactly where you think they are, it's just there were a lot of trees there. So many trees. The map was overwhelmed by their magnificence. Monarchs would squint at the page, then nod slowly, deciding that yes, that must be how it truly looked. Map makers were masters of diplomacy because they had no choice. Their entire livelihood rested on avoiding offense. They had to flatter kings while also subtly encouraging them to accept geographical realities. It was like navigating a marriage between two people who barely understood each other. The monarch wanted grandeur, the cartographer wanted accuracy, and somewhere in the middle was a map that was technically functional, artistically detailed, and politically safe. Now, let's float toward the emotional part of this dynamic, but gently, no sudden waves. Because map makers weren't immune to the stress of royal expectations. In fact, many of them internalized it deeply. There are letters from cartographers complaining about everything from eye strain to trembling hands.
One complained he could barely sleep because he was haunted by coastlines he hadn't finished shading. Another wrote that he feared the king's displeasure more than storms at sea, which tells you everything you need to know about job security in the 1500s. But there were perks too. A royal mapmaker had access to the latest voyage reports. They were among the first people in Europe to hear about new discoveries. They sometimes spent evenings in candlelit rooms listening to sailors recount the shape of an unfamiliar bay, taking notes like they were gathering spoilers for an upcoming geographic season finale. And although it was stressful, it also gave them a sense of purpose. These were people shaping the way the world literally looked to Europeans. Their maps hung in royal halls, they were given as diplomatic gifts. They defined trade routes. They influenced wars. They became part of the way monarchs understood their own power. So, being a royal mapmaker meant living at the intersection of knowledge and ego. It meant catering to someone's imperial dreams while quietly adjusting them to fit the actual shape of the earth. It meant smiling politely as a king explained why he was pretty sure the Atlantic Ocean wasn't that big. And through all of this, the mapmaker sits in the background, dipping their quill, trying not to sigh too loudly, and thinking, I really just wanted to draw coastlines.
Because tonight, we're floating into one of the most underrated chaotic partnerships in all of early modern history. The relationship between mapmakers and explorers. And honestly, it's a miracle any maps from this era make sense at all. Let's glide in. So, mapmakers were essentially the aftercare workers of the age of exploration. Explorers went out, got sunburned, saw things they couldn't always describe well, and then dumped all of that chaotic information onto the nearest cartographer, who now had to turn it into something that resembled a coherent coastline. Imagine, you're a trained geographer, someone who has spent years learning how to calculate distances using latitude tables and bits of string. And then a sailor bursts through your workshop door, smelling aggressively of the ocean and several weeks' worth of questionable hygiene, and says something like, I think we saw an island, or maybe it was a cloud. It moved, but the water was different there. And you have to write something down. Mapmakers learned quickly that explorers were both invaluable and completely unreliable. These were people who had spent months navigating with poorly calibrated compasses, food poisoning, and a vague sense of optimism. Their memory wasn't bad. It was just creatively flexible. Let's drift to a classic example. Christopher Columbus, the undisputed king of confident geographical misunderstandings. Columbus returned from his voyages full of certainty. He was absolutely convinced that he had reached Asia, which he absolutely had not. He described the Caribbean islands as though they were just off the coast of Cipangu, which he believed was Japan, and he gave distances that made no logical sense unless you assumed the Earth was about half its actual size. So mapmakers had a problem. They respected Columbus's status, but they also looked at his notes and went, Sir, none of this aligns with physics. But they had to draw something. Royal patrons wanted updated maps, and Columbus insisted his discoveries were exactly where he said they were. And so early maps of the New World became an artistic compromise between Columbus's confidence and reality's quiet, stubborn truth. There's something truly bedtime appropriate about watching a trained mapmaker gently massage a coastline into an approximation of what Columbus claimed to have seen. It's like tucking in a child who insists their stuffed bear is a dragon,
and you're just trying to make both of you happy. Let's float over to the Portuguese explorers now, who, to their credit, tended to be more observant. But they also traveled incredibly fast, too fast. They'd be at the coast of Africa one year, India the next, and Malacca the year after. Their letters home usually read like, "Saw a cape today, very large, hard to miss, turning left now. Thanks, Joe, extremely helpful." The mapmaker receiving that letter would sit there, dipping his quill in ink, wondering which direction left was supposed to be from the sailor's perspective. Was it left while heading north, or left while heading south, or left in the emotional sense? Sailors had their own way of describing things, and clarity was not always a priority. Many explorers also disagreed with each other. One said a coastline was concave, another said it was convex, a third insisted it didn't exist at all, and that previous sightings were hallucinations due to heat stroke. The truth was usually somewhere in between. So mapmakers developed a special skill set, the ability to read between the lines of a logbook written on 3 hours of sleep and a diet of salted cod. They learned to spot phrases like "we think," or "it seemed," or "the water behaved strangely," which usually meant, "I have no idea what this was, please do not ask follow-up questions." And of course, there were the classic over-dramatic explorers, the ones who came back with stories of monstrous beasts, glowing shorelines, or populations living entirely on the rooftops of their homes, which all turned out to be the result of dehydration or creatively interpreted shadows. Mapmakers had to decide, calmly and without hurting anyone's feelings, what parts of these stories to include. Too literal, and the map became ridiculous. Too skeptical, and the explorer complained to the king that the mapmaker was undermining his credibility. So again, they compromised. You might notice a pattern here. Compromise was basically the backbone of early mapmaking. Now, drift with me to the moment when an explorer actually sat down with a mapmaker. This didn't happen often. Usually their schedules didn't align, but when it did, it was a slow-motion collision between two very different worldviews. Picture it. The explorer sits down heavily, like a man who has spent several months sleeping on wood. He spreads out a map he drew on the ship, using charcoal while the boat was rocking aggressively. It's basically a collection of lumpy shapes connected by shaky lines. He points at one of the lumps. That's definitely the coastline. And the mapmaker, whose sense of precision is borderline spiritual, stares at it thinking, that looks like the silhouette of someone's left shoe. But he nods politely, because explorers were the primary eyewitnesses, however confusing those eyewitness accounts might be. He'd then try to extract more detail. How far from the coast were you when you saw this? Oh, you know, kind of close. How close is kind of? Well, close-ish. Did you see mountains? Yes, definitely. Or maybe hills. Or maybe they were clouds. The sun was bright. At this point, the mapmaker scribbles something in the margins that probably translates emotionally to fine. Yet, despite all this, explorers were essential. Without them, mapmakers had nothing, and many explorers genuinely tried to be helpful. They sketched stars, collected shells, described winds, recorded tides. Some even brought back small pieces of wood from the lands they visited because they thought it might help identify tree species. One Portuguese explorer famously collected so many samples of plants and rocks that the bottom of his ship sat lower in the water on the return trip. The mapmaker who received that shipment probably felt like it was Christmas morning, if Christmas morning involved the overwhelming smell of tropical botanicals and mold. Let's drift to another soothingly absurd scenario: the explorer who exaggerates everything. These were not liars. Well, not always. Often they were simply enthusiastic. They wanted their patrons to be impressed. They wanted to secure another voyage. They wanted the king to look at the map and say, "My goodness, this man discovered something extraordinary." Which led to iconic map descriptions like, "The river is wide enough for 20 ships to sail abreast." The river, in reality, fits maybe one canoe and a duck. The mountains rise higher than any seen in Europe. They were hills, barely hills. The local people number in the tens of thousands. There were, at most, 7. Mapmakers had to tone down these stories, smoothing out the rough edges of enthusiastic exaggeration. They'd reduce impossible mountain ranges to reasonable heights. They'd draw rivers narrower than described, but wide enough to avoid offending the explorer's pride. They were basically the editors of the age of exploration, the ones who took everyone's dramatic drafts and made them readable. And then there were the explorers who didn't exaggerate. They understated, which was just as unhelpful. One anonymous sailor described the Cape of Good Hope as a bit windy. This was an understatement so massive that it could only have been written by someone who was too traumatized to speak openly about the waves trying to flip his ship upside down. Mapmakers reading these reports had to make educated guesses about what the writer was downplaying due to emotional exhaustion. Let's float gently into the role of navigational instruments now, because this was another delightful point of contention between mapmakers and explorers. Explorers used tools like the astrolabe and crossstaff to calculate latitude, but accuracy depended on the user not drifting several degrees off course, which on a rocking ship was basically impossible. Longitude they couldn't measure at all yet, not precisely. They guessed using dead reckoning, which was essentially, how far does it feel like we went today? A method extremely vulnerable to both optimism and seasickness. So, when explorers returned with navigational data, mapmakers approached it like someone evaluating a child.
Let's glide in. So, mapmakers were essentially the aftercare workers of the age of exploration. Explorers went out, got sunburned, saw things they couldn't always describe well, and then dumped all of that chaotic information onto the nearest cartographer, who now had to turn it into something that resembled a coherent coastline. Imagine, you're a trained geographer, someone who has spent years learning how to calculate distances using latitude tables and bits of string. And then a sailor bursts through your workshop door, smelling aggressively of the ocean and several weeks' worth of questionable hygiene, and says something like, "I think we saw an island, or maybe it was a cloud. It moved, but the water was different there." And you have to write something down. Mapmakers learned quickly that explorers were both invaluable and completely unreliable. These were people who had spent months navigating with poorly calibrated compasses, food poisoning, and a vague sense of optimism. Their memory wasn't bad, it was just creatively flexible. Let's drift to a classic example. Christopher Columbus, the undisputed king of confident geographical misunderstandings. Columbus returned from his voyages full of certainty. He was absolutely convinced that he had reached Asia, which he absolutely had not. He described the Caribbean islands as though they were just off the coast of Sipangu, which he believed was Japan, and he gave distances that made no logical sense unless you assumed the Earth was about half its actual size. So mapmakers had a problem. They respected Columbus's status, but they also looked at his notes and went, "Sir, none of this aligns with physics." But they had to draw something. Royal patrons wanted updated maps, and Columbus insisted his discoveries were exactly where he said they were. And so early maps of the New World became an artistic compromise between Columbus's confidence and reality's quiet, stubborn truth. There's something truly bedtime appropriate about watching a trained mapmaker gently massage a coastline into an approximation of what Columbus claimed to have seen. It's like tucking in a child who insists their stuffed bear is a dragon, and you're just trying to make both of you happy. Let's float over to the Portuguese explorers now, who, to their credit, tended to be more observant. But they also traveled incredibly fast. Too fast. They'd be at the coast of Africa one year, India the next, and Malacca the year after. Their letters home usually read like, "Saw a cape today. Very large. Hard to miss. Turning left now." Thanks, Joao. Extremely helpful. The mapmaker receiving that letter would sit there, dipping his quill in ink, wondering which direction left was supposed to be from the sailor's perspective. Was it left while heading north, or left while heading south, or left in the emotional sense? Sailors had their own way of describing things, and clarity was not always a priority. Many explorers also disagreed with each other. One said a coastline was concave. Another said it was convex. A third insisted it didn't exist at all and that previous sightings were hallucinations due to heat stroke. The truth was usually somewhere in between. So mapmakers developed a special skill set, the ability to read between the lines of a logbook written on 3 hours of sleep and a diet of salted cod. They learned to spot phrases like, "we think," or "it seemed," or "the water behaved strangely," which usually meant, "I have no idea what this was, please do not ask follow-up questions." And of course, there were the classic, overdramatic explorers, the ones who came back with stories of monstrous beasts, glowing shorelines, or populations living entirely on the rooftops of their homes, all of which turned out to be the result of dehydration or creatively interpreted shadows. Mapmakers had to decide, calmly and without hurting anyone's feelings, what parts of these stories to include. Too literal, and the map became unreadable. Too skeptical, and the explorer complained to the king that the mapmaker was undermining his credibility. So again, they compromised. You might notice a pattern here. Compromise was basically the backbone of early mapmaking. Now drift with me to the moment when an explorer actually sat down with a mapmaker. This didn't happen often. Usually their schedules didn't align, but when it did, it was a slow-motion collision between two very different worldviews. Picture it. The explorer sits down heavily, like a man who has spent several months sleeping on wood. He spreads out a map he drew on the ship using charcoal while the boat was rocking aggressively. It's basically a collection of lumpy shapes connected by shaky lines. He points at one of the lumps. That's definitely the coastline. And the mapmaker, whose sense of precision is borderline spiritual, stares at it thinking, that looks like the silhouette of someone's left shoe. But he nods politely, because explorers were the primary eyewitnesses, however confusing those eyewitness accounts might be. He'd then try to extract more detail. How far from the coast were you when you saw this? Oh, kind of close. How close is kind of? Well, close-ish. Did you see mountains? Yes, definitely. Or maybe hills. Or maybe they were clouds. The sun was bright. At this point, the mapmaker scribbles something in the margins that probably translates emotionally to fine. Yet, despite all this, explorers were essential. Without them, mapmakers had nothing, and many explorers genuinely tried to be helpful. They sketched stars, collected shells, described winds, recorded tides. Some brought back small pieces of wood from the lands they visited because they thought it might help identify tree species. One Portuguese explorer famously collected so many samples of plants and rocks that the bottom of his ship sat lower in the water on the return trip. The mapmaker who received that shipment probably felt like it was Christmas morning, if Christmas morning involved the overwhelming smell of tropical botanicals and mold. Let's drift to another soothingly absurd scenario: the explorer who exaggerates everything. These were not liars. Well, not always. Often they were simply enthusiastic. They wanted their patrons to be impressed. They wanted to secure another voyage. They wanted the king to look at the map and say, "My goodness, this man discovered something extraordinary," which led to iconic map descriptions. The river is wide enough for 20 ships to sail abreast. The river in reality fits maybe one canoe and a duck. The mountains rise higher than any seen in Europe. They were hills, barely hills. The local people number in the tens of thousands. There were at most 7. So mapmakers had to tone these stories down, smoothing out the rough edges of enthusiastic exaggeration. They'd reduce impossible mountain ranges to reasonable height. They'd draw rivers narrower than described, but wide enough to avoid offending the explorer's pride. They were basically the editors of the age of exploration, the ones who took everyone's dramatic drafts and made them readable. And then there were the explorers who didn't exaggerate. They understated, which was just as unhelpful. One anonymous sailor described the Cape of Good Hope as a bit windy. This was an understatement so massive that it could only have been written by someone who was too traumatized to speak openly about the waves trying to flip his ship upside down. Mapmakers reading these reports had to make educated guesses about what the writer was downplaying due to emotional exhaustion. Let's float gently into the role of navigational instruments now, because this was another delightful point of contention between mapmakers and explorers. Explorers used tools like the astrolabe and cross staff to calculate latitude, but accuracy depended on the user not drifting several degrees off course, which on a rocking ship was basically impossible. Longitude they couldn't measure at all yet, not precisely. They guessed using dead reckoning, which was essentially how far does it feel like we went today, a method extremely vulnerable to both optimism and seasickness. So when explorers returned with navigational data, mapmakers approached it like someone evaluating a child's finger painting. They appreciated the effort. They admired the enthusiasm, but they also knew that the numbers didn't necessarily mean what the explorer thought they meant. Mapmakers developed a quiet, tired patience, the patience of someone who understood that sailors weren't trying to be vague. The world was just extremely difficult to measure with 16th century tools while being tossed around by the Atlantic. So they combined reports. They looked for patterns. If 3 explorers described something similarly, it was probably reliable. If one explorer described a landmass the size of France and everyone else said it was a tiny island, well, the mapmaker made an executive decision. But nowhere was the explorer-mapmaker tension more adorable, in a sleepy sort of way, than when it came to myths. Explorers regularly mentioned things that didn't exist. Entire continents, giant lakes, golden cities, waterfalls so large they swallowed the horizon. Mapmakers had to decide, include or exclude. If they excluded a mythical feature and it turned out to be real later, they'd be blamed. If they included it and it turned out to be imaginary, they'd be mocked by critics. So for many decades, the solution was, just draw it faintly. Light shading, a soft coastline, barely more than a whisper on the parchment. Something that said, this might be real, or it might be one sailor's hallucination. We refuse to commit.